Our next DevOps author is a performance engineering fellow at Catchpoint and a web performance consultant and trainer focused on building a web that everyone can use. He's the author of High Performance Images and Implementing Responsive Design, Building Sites for an Anywhere, Everywhere Web. He writes about all things web at timkadlec.com. In his upcoming talk, he shall shed some light on how to set an effective performance budget that actually sticks, becoming a vital part of your performance journey. Let's give a big round of victory wave for our speaker, Mr. Tim Kadlec.
Hey everyone. I wanted to start by talking about actually one of my favorite quotes around performance. And it doesn't come from a performance engineer. It doesn't come from a performance consultant. It doesn't come from any of the usual sources. It actually comes from a venture capitalist. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is that that's probably not where you would expect like a quote around performance to come from, right? Like venture capitalists are meant to, they look at companies in the early stages. They try to find those companies that have an idea that resonates, an idea that has a lot of potential, and then the ability to execute on that idea in a way that is eventually going to lead to that company getting very, very big and making lots of money. And so they learn to zero in on what are these like key characteristics or key traits that they're looking for in an organization. And so a very well-known venture capitalist, Fred Wilson, wrote an entire post about what he felt was the most important trait, at least from a technical aspect, of the startups that he was investing in. And it was performance. He said, first and foremost, we believe that speed is more than a feature. Speed is the most important feature. And you can look back at the post. He's not talking about speed of execution or anything like that. He's talking about the actual performance of the application or the site. Like how quickly does it load? How quickly can people interact with it? And it may sound a little dramatic to call it the number one, the most important feature, but there's actually ample evidence that's shown over and over and over again the critical role that performance plays in the user experience and overall business success. There's a site called WPO Stats that I co-maintain with Tammy Everts. And what we do here is we just collect performance case studies that are related to business and user engagement metrics. Anything that has been published or presented that demonstrates that like, hey, this company improved performance and they saw this impact on, some underlying metric that was key for their business. There's quite a few, like at this point, I'm 70 something case studies, I believe. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I thought a few of them I wanted to kind of highlight. Agrify, one of the newer ones that we've seen out, they made improvements to a lot of those core web vital metrics, things like largest contentful paint, cumulative layout shift, long task time, which is related to that first input delay vital. And they saw a 76% reduction in their abandonment rate, and they saw a significant boost in engagement. It's not just from that perspective. Ads get impacted here as well. Carousel reduced page load time by 65%. They saw a 63% increase in organic traffic, 3-time increase in advertising click-through rate, and a 46% increase in their first-time chatters on their product. One that I really like too that was recent was Aldo, because what they did is they actually compared mobile users who experienced a fast rendering time on their platform versus users with a slow rendering time. And what they found is that those who got those fast experiences brought 75% more revenue than the average number, and 327% more revenue than those who got slow rendering times. So in this case, the impact was very, very sizable. And in fact, they saw a very similar, in fact, bigger number difference on desktop between those fast and slow users. And of course, my favorite performance study comes from YouTube. Several years back now, this is a tale as old as time in performance land, at least, but it's worth reiterating. They had a couple engineers who looked at the video pages. The video pages weighed around 1.2 megabytes or so at the time. And they thought that was kind of ridiculous for basically something that amounted to showing a video and then having a commenting section. So they decided to build a lighter version, which eventually became something known as YouTube Feather. And the lighter version was 100 kilobytes, so 1/10 the size, a little less actually. So they put this out there as something that folks could opt into, could choose to use the Feather experience. And they went back and they checked the metrics. Now, they were expecting to see amazing performance metrics, right? Like it's 1/10 the size. Everything should just be flying fast. What they found out was actually that the page latency increased on Feather sessions versus the non-Feather sessions, which was a head scratcher. Like it was taking longer for videos to load on this lightweight page. So they dug deeper, and what they found is that they had a substantial traffic increase in places like Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, Siberia, a lot of locations where connectivity was a real challenge. And so what happened was word got out about this lightweight version of YouTube in these areas, and suddenly folks who had never used YouTube before were able to use the platform because of this lightweight version. Now, they never did a follow-up study on what that meant for those places' productivity once they were exposed to cat videos and all the other, YouTube landmines you can land yourself on. But the point here being that performance in this case was tantamount to accessibility. It enabled an entire new audience of users. Performance is a fundamental component of that user experience. And yet, it's often pushed to the back seat. It takes a backseat to other priorities. A lot of organizations are very, very feature driven. When I was doing performance consulting, I worked with a lot of e-com shops who would come and contact me shortly before the holiday season when all of their revenue and all that traffic spikes. Because one of two reasons: either A, they wanted to try and get some performance improvements out here in the last few minutes before they had to go into code freeze, or B, the fact that they got to that code freeze moment meant that they could pause feature development for a little bit, long enough to work on some performance stuff that they hadn't been able to prioritize the rest of the year. It often gets pushed into that sort of backseat instead of being a primary driver or primary focus of what we do. Now we're seeing that change a little bit, at least in the brief short period going on right now. Google's advocated for these core web vitals. By now, if you've paid attention to what Google is talking about or performance, these are probably well familiar with these, but they've got these 3 performance metrics. They're setting the thresholds as what they consider good versus poor versus needs improvement. And they're using these and factoring these into the search engine algorithm. So if you're hitting these metrics, that is going to help your ranking a little bit from the search engine perspective. They're also playing with how they use these signals to expose that a site is fast or slow. In the browser, there's already a few things hidden in the mobile browser that they take a while to get to, but there's already some signals there. They're talking about surfacing these in maybe a fast or a slow badge in search engine rankings themselves. They're using these metrics, and they've provided this big carrot in SEO. And so as a result, we've got, at least for now, a temporary push from a lot of organizations to improve performance, at least through the lens of these metrics. But what I'm curious about is what happens when all the dust settles. We know that this is going to factor into the algorithm. It's not going to be something that's going to push you from the bottom of page 1 to the top of page 1 by itself. It's more part of that fact thing versus like the deciding criteria. And we've seen in the past that over and over again that these performance pushes don't necessarily always stick. Google I/O, some members of the Chrome team got on stage and they talked about how they work with a lot of organizations to improve performance. But unfortunately, what they were finding was that when they went back and looked at these brands after, 40% of those brands regressed on performance within 6 months of doing a concerted performance push. They threw all the resources, they threw the budget, they did all the right things, made a ton of performance improvements, and within 6 months, they were back to where they were. That's a little disheartening, but it's also kind of understandable, I think, because performance is as much a cultural challenge as it is a technical one. The technical bit is actually the easy part. Going through and finding out what those technical issues are and how to fix them and making those changes oftentimes is a much less painful process than transforming the culture of the organization itself to focus on performance first and foremost. Now, I've, again, worked with a lot of organizations. I've talked to a lot of organizations, and there's a couple characteristics that I think are common across orgs that do have this performance-minded culture. First up is top-down support, and this is a big one. Like, if you don't have the support from the top down throughout the organization, you're very, very unlikely to get resources that you need to establish a culture of performance for the long haul. Very few orgs start with this, by the way. This is usually something you have to build to. The rare exception is if you have somebody who is a very performance-minded engineer who moves into that leadership role of CEO or CTO. Sometimes you get a little bit of a head start there, but usually you have to work hard to get this. Companies with a strong culture of performance use data. They're very data-driven. They carefully monitor the impact of their optimizations using both synthetic tools like, Catchpoint or Webpage test or Lighthouse, as well as RUM data, real user monitoring. So they're monitoring the impact of their optimizations on their raw performance metrics, but also on those user-focused and business metrics that we talked about. They tend to have very clear targets. Now, we're going to come back to this again in a minute. Whether or not they call it a performance budget doesn't really matter. Those companies do, though, have very clear performance goals that are guiding the work that they're doing. Companies with a strong culture of performance also have automation. They understand that performance has to be baked in for it to stick. And so that automation is what helps lay the groundwork for the performance efforts. Automation in terms of applying some of those optimizations, but also automation in terms of supporting those optimizations and supporting those performance goals that they're putting into place. Knowledge sharing is another key one. It doesn't matter so much about structure. Like, it does not matter if you have a dedicated performance team or not. In fact, many orgs with strong performance cultures don't. But the key here is that knowledge about those optimizations, those metrics, those goals, the monitoring, it can't be locked up within a few individuals or one team. Because if it is, you're unlikely to achieve any sort of sustainable success. Companies with those strong performance cultures find ways to share the knowledge and distribute it across a team through training, lunch and learns, common dashboards, performance champions, documentation, things like that. And finally, or I guess there's actually two more. There's culture of experimentation. A lot of performance work relies on this experimentation. You think an optimization is going to provide meaningful returns, or you think by shipping a page that's 1/10 of the size of the original, you're going to get faster metrics. That doesn't always play out in practice. So a lot of these orgs will ship things incrementally, one at a time, do a lot of A/B testing, do a lot of experiment to understand what the impact is and why. And finally, you'll notice that none of those characteristics above prescribe a certain tool or framework. I didn't say like any of them use React, or you have to use Vue, or you have to use this tool or this backend service. Only automation, in fact, has any sort of tool-centric sort of approach here. Every other characteristic here is much more about the people and the processes. Those companies with that strong performance culture put the focus on the user, not on specific tools. They're not afraid of the tools, but they're critical of them. They recognize that tools are there to support their culture, not to dominate it. So these are the common characteristics that I see around culture or companies with those cultures of performance. And there's one piece in particular that I want to focus on today that kind of connects quite a few of these. It comes into play from the organization-wide support side of things, being data-driven, the clear targets. It ties into the automation and the knowledge sharing. There's a lot, it touches pretty much every aspect of that. And this is performance budgets. Now, if anybody's not familiar, performance budget, hopefully you're familiar with budgeting from a personal aspect or a business aspect. Performance budgets are applying that concept to your application or site. You say, hey, we're going to have start render occur within 1 second. And anything over that, we're not going to ship. You set a threshold on something, you monitor it, and then you make sure that if that threshold is exceeded, things don't go out into production. And it can be an extremely beneficial approach for organizations this is a huge component of that culture of performance. Paul Armstrong for Twitter wrote about how, they set a budget for tracking and reported their build size deltas, and they prevented changes that would have increased metrics like time to interactive or time to first meaningful content paint and time to first tweet, which is their own custom metric that they use to show like when does the first tweet on a page show up, by over 100%. Having the budget in place and checking those deltas prevented these regressions. Now, there's a lot of folks I've seen argue that performance budgets potentially aren't that useful, but it depends entirely on how you're applying the budget themselves. The way I define performance budget has sort of evolved over the years. I've been talking about performance budgets for, I guess, since 2012 now, so almost a decade. The way I define it today is a clearly defined limit on one or more performance metrics that the team agrees not to exceed, and that is used to guide design and development. And there's a few key pieces here that are critical for if that performance budget is actually going to stick. It has to be clearly defined. The team has to agree on it. It has to be used to guide design and development. In fact, we can break this down, I guess, into 4 things that I think a performance budget that is going to stick, that is going to resonate and be effective, has to have. It has to be concrete, it has to be meaningful, it has to be integrated, and it has to be enforced. So let's dive into each of those tests to kind of, show what I mean here. So first off, it has to be concrete. There's a lot of situations, a lot of times where you'll hear an organization or a company get really excited about performance for a little bit. And in fact, you've probably heard phrases like this thrown around in a meeting, like, oh, we want to be this lightning quick, or we need to make this as fast as possible. Or, there's definitely a lot of folks who do competitor benchmarking and say, well, we want to be faster than that competition. Now, these are all fine. There's nothing wrong with getting excited, throwing these terms out. But you can't really rally a team around the goal of as fast as possible. What does that even mean? Like, to somebody like me, that means instantaneous, right? I'm a performance nut. I'm a performance zealot. So like, as fast as possible has a different meaning to me than other folks. Or lightning quick. It's too abstract. Faster than the competition is a little bit better because at least you have a benchmark there. But even then, there's a little bit of a moving target, right? Like, if you're competing against competitor A and competitor B, and competitor B comes out with a performance push and suddenly they're 50% faster, your budget has just changed. Like, your goal has just changed overnight, which may be fine. Maybe this is like a thing. You want to constantly be number one, but having those moving targets while you're trying to make a concerted push can be disheartening or very, very challenging. Imagine you're in the middle of a 6-month concerted performance push, and in month 5, and this is what you're guiding it on, is the competition. And in month 5, 2 of your competitors do overnight performance transformations, like ship something out. You have a month left and suddenly your entire goal has been shot, right? These things don't work. They don't hold up in the long term. It's much better to be more concrete with it. So for an example, I might say no more than 2 seconds to start render, the time that it appears for, something to appear on the screen, at the 90th percentile on 3G networks. There's a couple key things here, right? We've given a very clear number that we're after, 2 seconds. We've defined what that metric is going to be, start render. So we know the exact metric, we know the exact number. We've defined the percentile. This is important too, because if we're looking at our real user data to sort of support those optimization things, we want to make sure that we know, where are we looking? Are we looking at the median? Are we looking at the 25th percentile? Generally, my recommendation for most organizations is hit that 75th or 90th percentile, because if you make improvements for folks in that long tail of your experience, everybody else is going to benefit. On the other hand, if you're targeting the 25th percentile, you may move the needle there sometimes, but you may have people in the 50th or 75th or 90th percentile that are getting obnoxiously slow experiences. So shifting to that long tail focus, I think, is critical. It also opens up things like the YouTube feather story, where because you've optimized performance for folks that are hitting the slower experiences, you potentially are opening up a new avenue for growth and folks to access your site or application who couldn't before. So we have some very key things here: the target, the metric, how we're going to measure it. And we've even put a condition on that. Like, we're going to check on those 3G networks. If you're using a bunch of different tools in an organization, you've probably run into a situation where, what you're getting from Lighthouse could be very different from what you're getting from Webpage tests, from page speed insights, from your own dev tools. The more sources you have, the more chaotic it is, the harder it is to focus. So you need to kind of say, this is what we're going to look at here. And also remember, a little goes a long way. There's a temptation sometimes for folks who have not done these before to immediately come out with, this is our budget on 3G for the homepage and on cable for the homepage. This is our for mobile, for desktop. This is the product page, has an entirely different budget. All of that may eventually be fine, but when you're starting out, the more budgets you have, the more problems it can be. If you're first starting to adopt a performance budget, pick 1 or 2 or 3, go small and focus on those. And you can get more complex and you can get more granular and stuff like that as you build up that culture. But you don't want to bite off more than you can chew right away, because it's going to cause too much chaos. It's probably going to be challenging for folks to rally around initially as you're trying to build up that sort of support system. So start simple. So concrete. The next thing performance budgets that stick is they're meaningful. They're not just an abstract number picked somewhere that you read in a blog post or you saw in a talk somewhere. You've thought them through. So I want to walk through a little bit about how we choose those metrics and what's available to us there. Now, generally, the way I like to break this down is performance metrics typically fall into one of three basic categories. You have your quantity-based metrics, your rule-based metrics, and your milestone timings. So quantity-based metrics, those are metrics related to the quantity of something. How many requests, how many bytes, that kind of a thing. They have some pros and cons, just as all of these different metrics do. Like that, if there's one takeaway here that you get out of these metrics section, it's that each type of metric is going to have a strength that you can emphasize somewhere in your process, but it's also going to have some weaknesses. So with quantity-based metrics, they tend to be pretty easy to understand, right? Like it's fairly straightforward. If my budget is 50K, I've got 50 kilobytes to spend, okay? Or 500 kilobytes or 10 requests, whatever it is, it's pretty clear to communicate. There's also a very clear tie to the design and development process. If I set a budget of 500 kilobytes of JavaScript, for example, which is way too high, let's bring that back down. If I set a budget to like 100 kilobytes of JavaScript, it's pretty clear to me as a developer that, hey, if I'm going to pull in this framework that's 20K, that's going to add 20K to my current bundle, and it's probably going to put me over the budget or whatever. There's that clear tie in that process, which is very convenient. There's a weak connection to the user experience, however. The number of requests is more or less at this point useless from a user experience perspective. If certainly above a certain threshold, they become obnoxious, but I've seen, sites with 50 requests outperform sites with 10 requests. It's totally possible. There's a lot of variability there. So the number of requests is particularly useless in this situation. The number of bytes is a little bit more meaningful. There are lots of places where, network capacity is still a significant challenge. Data costs are still a significant challenge. So there is some connection there. But again, if you're hitting an audience where that's not such a problem, and it's becoming better and better as the years go on, I've seen, again, sites that are several times the size of another site that don't actually, they perform faster if you're looking at the actual user-based metrics, even though they weigh more. So quantity-based metrics you have to be a little bit careful with because that connection to the user experience is pretty tenuous. So if I was doing like a spectrum here, I would say quantity-based metrics are pretty far out over here, pretty distanced from the actual user experience. Now, rule-based metrics are metrics that are based on an adherence to a set of rules or guidelines. The most popular by far here is Lighthouse. Or I guess Lighthouse is taking an adherence of set of rules of guidelines. In their case, their rules or guidelines are certain metric thresholds. They are bringing in metrics into this to some extent, which is an improvement over things like YSlow or Page Speed Insights historically, where the grade was entirely based on my adherence to these checklists of basic optimizations. So it's an improvement there. And those rule-based, those, sort of graded metrics, those are easy to understand, right? All of us have been to school. We kind of all understand how like grading systems work. They tend to be a very solid checklist of those basic optimizations, but there tends to be a weak connection to user experience. Again, Lighthouse is a little bit better because Lighthouse is actually not looking at those optimizations that they list in their report. They're looking at these like 5 or 6 metrics that they factor into the score. So there's a little bit stronger connection here, but it's still a little weak. And you still get a lot of things like this, unfortunately. A friend of mine working at Shopify discovered several sites doing UA checks for Lighthouse and then using document.write to change the impact or the performance of their page for Lighthouse specifically, which makes no sense because Chrome isn't even looking at Lighthouse data for SEO. So don't game the Lighthouse scores. But it is something we see a lot, this sort of like gaming thing. And it's sort of another evidence that like, just keeping in mind that there's a tenuous connection there. It's trying to establish a connection, but it's not exactly one-to-one. So rule-based, I tend to put it pretty far out from the user experience spectrum as well. Again, Lighthouse is a little better than the things that we've seen in the past, but there's still a bit of a weak correlation. Then you get milestone timings. Now, this is where the bulk of performance metrics fall into. This is timing of a specific milestone over the course of the loading of a page. So this is things like time to first byte. When does that first byte of HTML come back after navigation has started? Start render. When does stuff appear on the screen? Largest contentful paint. When does the largest piece of content get on the screen? These are all milestones over the course of a page load process. Now, these are easy to track typically for the most part. Anything that's, any decent synthetic tool, any decent RUM provider is going to provide the ability to track a lot of these metrics. They're often easy to communicate. Time to first byte doesn't take a lot of time to explain, at least on the surface, what it does. Obviously, they get more complicated as you start to dig into like exactly how it's calculated and all that stuff. But I can communicate the high level overview of these metrics pretty quickly to somebody without a technical background. And with things like user timing and element timing, you're able to give very specific metrics. We mentioned time to first tweet from Twitter. I know Pinterest has pinner wait time. There's a lot of organizations that are adopting these custom marks, and they're able to easily add that in with user timing. Or with element timing, you can add an attribute to an image or to a headline and start getting timing on when that starts to appear. So you have a lot of ability to go very custom here, which is good. The caveat one is that there is a potentially limited view of the user experience. That's why Core Web Vitals is focusing on 3 metrics that are each telling you something different about the loading phase. Because if you just targeted one individual one, like largest contentful paint, you could be missing a lot of different pieces. Like, how does it actually interact when people are using the page? Like, how quickly does it respond? How quickly do we get immediate feedback out? You'd get just a little bit of a lens here. So you do want to be careful of sort of supporting these milestone timings with a couple that are each telling you a different part of that page load experience. One thing that I've seen organizations do here is break this down into meta versus primary metrics. So for example, you may decide that a primary metric for you is total blocking time. One of those Core Web Vitals, how long is the main thread blocked by JavaScript? But then that may be where you put your focus and your budget, but then you may look at some meta supporting metrics that help to tell that story a little bit too. Like, all right, if total blocking time is my key one, well, maybe I want to track the number of long JavaScript tasks as well. Maybe I want to track the longest long task and look at these little things. And I don't have goals or budgets assigned in them, but they help me understand what the total blocking time is telling me and where that's coming from. The other thing with milestone timings that I don't note here, but it's probably worth bringing up, it's a little tougher to enforce these in the development and design process. We mentioned that if like I have a kilobyte, for example, budget, it's easy for designer development to know that this image or this script is going to add X amount to my budget. If my timing budget is 2 seconds on start render, it's a little bit more tenuous. Like as a developer, I can't just look at a 10K script and be like, that's going to add 500 milliseconds. I don't know exactly. I have to do a little bit more testing. So it's not insurmountable, but it does mean you have to support those a little bit better in that design development process. So depending on what you pick for milestone timings, you can be a little bit removed from that user experience, or you can get very, very close to that user experience. So the first thing is, looking at those types of metrics, keeping those in mind. The next thing from a meaningful perspective is what we want to choose is something that's going to impact the user engagement or going to impact the business metrics. Now, ideally, you've got your own real user data. If you've got your own real user data, you can do things like this, which is plot like a metric, in this case, start render, versus your bounce time and see if there's a connection. And in this graph, what we see very clearly is that there is a strong connection between bounce rate and start render. As our start render time gets slower and slower, the bounce rate continues to go higher and higher and higher. So start render would be a really good choice for this organization to choose from a budget perspective. You want to do some experimentation on your own to kind of see what those metrics are for you. If you don't have this yet, you don't have the user engagement and performance data together, first off, try to get to that point, because that's how you're going to sort of maintain performance long haul, is being able to show that business impact. But secondly, some good starters are start render is pretty consistently connected to user engagement metrics in my experience. Things like long task time, any of those JavaScript CPU time things have also been pretty routinely connected to user experience and business metrics with the organizations I've worked with. Those are good, safe bets. So you try to choose a metric or a target that is going to be meaningful from the audience and business perspective. Then you have to choose what the target is actually going to be. Now, there's a few ways of doing this. I'll walk you through one that I did for a project for Radio Free Europe a few years back. There's a tool called Webpage Test Bulk Tester, which is built by Andy Davies. It's a Google spreadsheet integration and app script for the spreadsheets that lets you bulk test URLs. You drop in basically the URL and whatever those testing conditions are, and it'll automatically come back and populate all the data. So what we did is we ran Radio Free Europe and a few competitors through this spreadsheet, had it come back, drop the data in, and then automatically, through the magic of spreadsheets, create 20% better targets. So 20% is a number that there's some science to show that people recognize a difference in performance, software and stuff like that, if that difference in performance is over 20%. So that's where we came up with this 20% threshold. So for them, we wanted to find out, like right away, we were starting with a fresh build of their site. It made sense to be ambitious, look at their site, look at their competitors, and make sure that we had a target that was going to be at least 20% faster than all of that. And so this is the process we did there. You have to be careful about this. There's definitely a difference between goals and thresholds. Radio Free Europe in this situation, performance was such a huge piece. Like there are, people who are risking their lives using that site in some places. Loading fast was important. And they had the team and they had the capacity, and we were starting over fresh for them. So it made sense to have an ambitious goal. But as my friend Harry Roberts puts it, most organizations aren't ready for challenges. What they're in need of is those safety nets. So going out there and trying to ambitiously say, we're going to be 20% better than everybody and than where we are currently, it's great if you got a fresh start and you've got the support and the engineering to do it. But for most folks, what you're looking at is like, how do we stop ourselves from getting worse today? And then how do we make some incremental improvements after? So a better way for most organizations to start with performance budgets, as Harry suggests, is look at those last 2 weeks. Now, I put a caveat here on the 2 weeks. It could be a month, it could be 3 weeks. I think it tends to work really well if it's lined up with whatever your sprints are set to or something like that. But basically, look at those last few weeks of traffic for the metric that you care about. And what you're looking for is you're looking to see how many times would you exceed whatever particular threshold that you would set. You want to choose a number. Harry suggests the worst over those last 2 weeks. I don't necessarily know if I'd say the worst, but I would say choose a number that is not going to trigger a ton of alerts and break things all the time. So for example, if we're looking at a metric over the last 2 weeks, this is visually complete. The red line here represents a hypothetical 3-second budget. We're consistently over the last 2 weeks way under budget. So 3 seconds doesn't make sense for us to set here because it's too conservative. It's not actually helping us make any meaningful improvements. In fact, we can get worse for a little while before this budget ever does a thing. This is more like what we're looking for. This is a hypothetical 2-second start render budget. And you can see that there's a few situations here. We got 4 days over the last 2 weeks where we would have triggered that budget. This is about right. That's not too many alerts. We're not, getting annoyed by that, but the budget is actually doing something, right? Like it's pretty in line with where we are. We're not creeping up a lot to go over it, that kind of thing. On the other hand, this is one that's way too aggressive. Here we've got a 6-second fully loaded time budget, and we are constantly over budget in the last 2 weeks. So in a situation like this, our budget was far too aggressive. If we put anything to enforce this budget, or we do any sort of alerting, people are just going to get super annoyed right away because we're climbing out we're already starting at a disadvantage. So you start in those last 2 weeks, you pick your data point, and then you visit this stuff again every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, and you continually shift. So if I look back 2 weeks later and I'm still looking like this, I probably need to loosen my budget a bit because it's not working out. If I look back over 2 weeks and we're sitting like this, which is the ideal, then maybe I can make that budget a little bit more aggressive going forward. But treat it in the sort of this incremental, constantly improving fashion ensures that you sort of maintain that balance between, a too aggressive budget and something that's not aggressive enough. Those budgets need to be integrated then into the process. What I would say is if the engineers are the first ones working with the budget, it's too late. You want those budgets spelled out organization-wide. I've seen companies use them to guide SLAs, both internally as well as with vendors. On that Radio Free Europe project, we had sort of this component bar across the top that we chose to put the budget right in there. So every time we loaded a page while we were doing development, we saw either a green mark saying we were under budget or a red mark saying we were over budget on every single page load. So as we were writing the code, we could tell how we were holding up and how we were doing. Then I've seen designers use these. Dan Mall wrote a book, article about performance budgets. He's a designer talking about how he uses some fuzzy math. Like if he comes up with these target times based on those thresholds, he'll do some fuzzy math over a 3G connection and say, okay, this is roughly how many kilobytes I can spend to get to that point. Now, there's obviously some variability here. 114K doesn't necessarily mean you're going to hit that start render budget, but it at least gets you into the ballpark. There's also budget calculators that do this sort of same idea. And again, there's some variability here. Like JavaScript bytes are much more expensive than image bytes or CSS bytes. So there's technically, this isn't the most accurate way to do it. But the point here is what you're doing is if you've got your milestone timing as your primary thing and you find a fuzzy metric bite size wise that can be used in that design and development process, you at least get that conversation going as early as possible. Katie Kowalson, another designer, wrote about how they had a budget like that. They had translated back to bytes and they used it for everything, including font choice. They had a bunch of different fonts they were looking between. In the end, they ended up going with this Tisa Pro font because it was 48K less than Chaparral Pro. They were close enough. For all intents and purposes, people liked both, but one was 50K less. And because performance was part of that early discussion, they decided to prioritize it. Integrated means early in the flow, but it also means later in the flow or in the point of where you're actually writing the code. This has been a focus for us at Webpage Test recently. We've got a VS Code extension where right inside of the editor, you can run tests through Webpage Test and get the data back. So as we're making those code changes, we can find issues because it's much easier to fix them at that moment. Or later, a lot of organizations are using Slack or Teams for sort of, if there is an issue, diving into it and figuring out what's going on. So pulling that data into your Slack bot, through a Slack bot or into your Teams, that could be a very meaningful way of sort of integrating that into those stages as well. And finally, those budgets need to be enforced. It doesn't do much good if we just say there's a budget, but then nobody actually does anything to enforce it. So I'm a big fan of doing that in the CI/CD process. GitHub Action was one of the first things we put out around that. The idea being that here, if you put like a PR on any pull request, it'll automatically check your budget. And if your budget is exceeded, if the budget exceeds the threshold, your PR cannot be merged. The check fails. You know that there's a problem there. You also get detailed data right there in the PR so that you can make a decision around why is that budget being exceeded? What's going on here? A very common one that I see is bundle size. Bundle size is very useful if you're doing any sort of JavaScript heavy architecture to watch the threshold on the budget itself, on the JavaScript itself to make sure a certain threshold of size isn't exceeded. You got to be careful there. You got to give yourself a little wiggle room. One company that I worked with did put budgets out. We're very excited about it, but you'll notice the very first time a developer ran into it, the budget was exceeded by 82 bytes. It was basically a rounding error as it turned out. But the point being, you don't want to give an absolute budget with no wiggle room at all, because if somebody merges in something that's 1K higher from a CSS, like a new version of a CSS file or a JavaScript library, and it's just a hair higher, you don't want to necessarily block everything from going out because of that. Walmart grocery has a very healthy process, I think. They have these job checks and logs that they log the size of every single build. They're doing these bundle checks on their JavaScript and CSS, breaking them out into individual budgets. So you can see here in the bottom where they're showing the percentage difference. A PR fails if the size goes up by over 1% on any of those main bundles. And if it fails, then their performance engineer comes in and it gets escalated to them so they can kind of dive in and figure out what's going on. So not only are they checking the budget, they're giving a little bit of wiggle room in that 1%, but they're also providing the support. They're making sure that engineers aren't like, what the heck's going on? There's somebody whose job it is to come in and say, okay, hey, I know performance really well. We're up a little bit. Let me dive in and figure out what's going on so those engineers can get back to shipping code. Ultimately, it ends into a very cool thing. Like Preact, if anybody's familiar, it's a 3 kilobyte alternative to React, very tiny, very small. that smallness, the size of that bundle is a core principle for Preact, a guiding principle for them. And so at a podcast, a Shop Talk Show episode, they talked about how this having such an aggressive target on the actual size of their file led to really cool code golf. Like their maintainers, everybody was diving in and doing this concerted push to get the size down and seeing like coming up with these creative solutions on how to shave a few kilobytes here and there. That's kind of a fun thing. Like engineers love a good fun and challenge. Like what if we did the occasional perf week push inside of an organization, right? If we had, for a week, we say, okay, here's where we are. Let's set a little bit more aggressive budget. For 1 week, let's all pound on this together and see what we can do. You'd get some really creative solutions. I'm sure you'd make a ton of progress as well and have a lot of fun doing it. Ultimately, that's the goal here. That's the thing that performance budgets enable. They are a unifying target, something that the entire team, the entire organization can rally around. It's a clear benchmark that you've put integrated into your system. You've made sure it's a meaningful metric. So when you hit this, it's going to have an impact on your business and user engagement. And again, the entire team knows what's going on. So folks are all coming at it together. It's not just one or two people, in their definition of fast competing with somebody else's. If you're there's a lot of folks who have written about this, have talked about it. Giuseppe Perez Cruz is a designer who gave a great presentation about it. Adi Osmani has written a nice overview. Alex Russell wrote one that's very driven by sort of real world connectivity and network. I mentioned Harry Roberts. He has a post about how to do these pragmatically, which gets into sort of that idea about goals versus thresholds and how do you set that over 2 weeks. A lot of, I've written a few things, Tammy Everts. There's a lot of stuff out there, tons of resources to dig into. If there's one thing though, I want to, just caveat with all of this is be patient. When we're talking about getting a performance budget in place and particularly leaping to that sort of strong performance culture that we talked about, this is a journey that's often measured in years, not months. Most organizations I've talked to that have gotten to that place where the budget is firmly integrated and have gotten to the place where they're confident that they're maintaining performance, they're proactively preventing regressions, they've got that strong performance culture, or at least some of those 7 characteristics we've talked about. It took them years to get there. It wasn't like 2 months later. Progress in this case is absolutely made one baby step at a time. That's how you get better at performance. That's how you make your progress here, is you do something better today, then something better the next day, and so on, until eventually that piles up and you've got this strong culture and you know that you're shipping things that are going to perform well, both for your users and ultimately that it's going to benefit your business as well. Thank you.